Lauren Herzer, and along with my colleagues in the Environmental Change and Security Program, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Wilson Center for today's event on the role of local institutions in climate change adaptation. We're very pleased to be partnering with Oxfam to host this event, and I want to especially thank Kathleen Mogelgaard for helping to coordinate today's meeting. First, a quick note about where you're sitting. The Wilson Center is the official memorial to Woodrow Wilson, who was the only president thus far to have a PhD. The center acts as a living memorial where scholars, practitioners, and policymakers gather to bridge the worlds of academia and public policy. As such, we're pleased to be hosting today's discussion focused on a new report just put out by Oxfam in January of this year. If you didn't have a chance to grab it on your way in, make sure you grab it on your way out. The report, based on field research carried out in Ethiopia and Mali, examines social aspects of adaptation around several themes, including production strategies, land and water governance institutions, social support systems, household and gender dynamics, and weather and climate information. The topic of today's event is near and dear to the project we have in collaboration with USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation. The Resources for Peace project brings scholars, practitioners, and policymakers together from across sectors to take a closer look at climate change, natural resources, conflict, and peace building. We're very pleased that one of our partners on that project from USAID, Cynthia Brady, will be moderating today's session. As a senior conflict advisor in the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, Cynthia is the agency's technical lead on natural resources and conflict. We are also thrilled to be hosting Todd Crane, Belai Casa, and Heather McRae. Hopefully you had a chance to grab their bios on the way in, as Cynthia will just be giving a very short introduction to each so that we can have more time for a discussion. A quick logistical note, this meeting is being videotaped and will be archived on our event webpage. So if you have a question at the end, please raise your hand and one of my colleagues will deliver a microphone for you to speak into. Please introduce yourself and ask your question into the mic so that the videotape can capture the recording. If you need to leave the room at any point in the meeting, please take care to close the door quietly behind you so that we can avoid further disruptions. With that, I thank you again for joining us today and hand the mic over to Cynthia.
Thank you, Lauren. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm pleased that we are able to sit today and discuss this very interesting report from Oxfam, which I personally gained a lot from reading. And we will begin the session with our three panelists and then move to a question and answer discussion session. And Heather is going to kick us off. Heather is the co-director for the Adaptation Initiative at the World Resources Institute. Her research has emphasized national level adaptation planning in developing countries, design of international adaptation finance programs, monitoring and evaluation, and options for the United Nations climate negotiations. Second will be Todd, who is an assistant professor in the Technology and Agrarian Development Group at Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and his research focuses primarily on climate and agriculture through the lens of ecological anthropology in order to understand adaptation processes. Third, we will have Belai, who is an economic justice policy advisor with Oxfam America. Prior to joining Oxfam, he was professor of agricultural economics and president of Haramaya University in Ethiopia. And after Belai, we'll turn the floor over to Todd one last time for some final remarks before we move into our discussion session. So with that said, let me turn the floor over to Heather.
Thank you. It's pleasure to be here today. Let's see if I can get my slides up. All right. I work at the World Resources Institute, and we have quite an interest in the topic of today's discussion. We see institutions as one of the key elements in thinking about adaptation to climate change. And I thought I would actually talk a little bit outside of the topic. I know our focus is local institutions, but we have quite a bit of work focused on national institutions, and I think the interface of these two lenses on institutions for adaptation is an important one. Hopefully this will help frame the discussion in some of the more detailed case studies that you'll hear from the other speakers. We've actually had the luxury over the last several months at WRI of reviewing our work on climate change adaptation And we've distilled some lessons out of it that we're calling our Adaptation Manifesto. With three principles I thought I would share with you. This is my first time presenting these three principles. I'm curious what you think. Our first one of principle for adaptation is to start where you are. No matter where you are in the world, what country you're in, adaptation's happening. And it may not be where you think it is, and it may not be necessarily planned or intentional in a very formal way, but it's happening. And there's strengths and resources from which to build if you're aiming for planned adaptation. So this is the first principle we are focusing on. The second is apply and learn and apply. This is fundamentally still a very new endeavor, adapting to climate change, and there's quite a lot of learning that needs to be done. This is also going to be an iterative process. We're not going to adapt and be done with it, and we'll be all set for the rest of climate change. This is something we're going to have to contend with iteratively, and making this at the heart of our manifesto was very important to us. The third principle is to value institutions, and as I said before, and as I trust you all believe coming to a presentation with this topic, institutions are at the heart of adaptation. Adaptation is fundamentally a change in our decision-making processes, not just some practices and technologies, but those processes are governed by institutions, and so changes in institutions and how they function is at the heart of what we see as critical for this work. So with that brief introduction, I thought I'd talk briefly about some of the traits that we see as critical for adaptive institutions. And in this I draw largely from a report the World Resources Institute put out about 2 years ago. This is the World Resources Report 2010, and it's titled Decision Making in a Changing Climate. It's online. I have a couple of hard copies here for those of you who love paper. But some of the sort of basic principles, the basic traits of adaptive institutions from this work turned out to be flexibility and responsiveness. Probably no surprises there. As things change, as they become more surprising, we need to have institutions that can be flexible and adjust quickly. Secondly, coordinated institutions are another key trait. Coordination across different institutions, across different departments or levels within institutional structures, coordination across disciplines and sectors. These are critical pieces of adaptation. Transparent and participatory, this is important, and I suspect we'll hear more on this from our other speakers. Forward thinking, looking into the future. This is not something institutions are always good at. Many of our institutions are bound by electoral cycles, for example, or by annual reporting periods. Thinking far into the future, not always so easy for institutions. And then the last bullet we have here is risk-oriented. Risk is something people and institutions contend with all the time, but they really vary in the expertise that they bring to their contending with risk, and the intention and consciousness, I think, with which we think about risk. And risk in the climate is, in some ways, an old story. We've had risky climatic phenomena for millennia, but in other ways it's new. There's new risk profiles coming, and so contending with risk in new ways is one of the traits we look for from our institutions. At the local level, I wanted to raise to your attention a framework developed by a coalition including CARE and the Overseas Development Institute and several other partners. This is not a super clear slide, but it was an interesting effort at the local level to break adaptive capacity into some constituent elements. And you can see that the asset base, that natural resources and financial capital and these kinds of things are one element of the framework. But we have over here institutions and entitlements got called out as a specific element. And then I would actually say many of the other pieces of this framework for local adaptive capacity, knowledge and information, innovation, flexible and forward-looking decision-making, these are all mediated by institutions. This is one of several adaptive capacity frameworks that are out there. It's at WRI, we've created one at the national level that's not unlike this. But you get a sense for how the kinds of things that we care about when we think about adaptation and adaptive capacity, they're very linked to institutions. This is one of my main interests here is, of course, institutions connect with each other across scales, and we don't want to forget this. At the local level, we have a certain set of institutions, but their activities are facilitated or constrained by institutions and by governance constructs at higher levels as well. And this linkages, this flow of resources or information or whatever it may be across scales, I think is an important thing to consider when we consider what local institutions can and should be doing as the climate changes. And if we want to empower those institutions, it's helpful to keep these other levels of institutional structure in mind. This is, in a way, a more complicated version of that previous slide. I like this framework quite a lot. It comes from a scholar named Arun Agrawal at the University of Michigan. And you can see here at the bottom, there's a typology of things that can be done at the local level by way of adaptation. So mobility, moving from one place to another is one way of adapting. Storing resources, storing grain over from season to season, having resources in reserve to contend with an emergency or a shock. These kinds of adaptation activities are mediated by these kinds of, here at the top, local institutions. So there's public institutions like elected government, like bureaucratic agencies. There's cooperatives, there's service organizations, private businesses. There's a whole range of ways of breaking the institutional picture into types and into components. And then here in the center, we have these enabling factors of what is it that can flow to these local institutions from higher levels of governance. And you see information, technology, finance and leadership. And I would argue that rights and legal mandates for local institutions, these are also really important components of what the higher levels of governance may convey as facilitation or as barriers to adaptation for local institutions. So quite a complex picture, but a possible one to analyze, not impossible at all to analyze. And there's typologies like this out there. At WRI, we have our typology. Ours is focused on the national level. I'm happy to talk about this in more detail if it's of interest at all, and it's summarized quite well in this report with several case studies looking at Ireland and Nepal and Bolivia. But we looked at kind of 5 functions of national institutions that are important for improving adaptation. As part of that learn and apply and learn, there's an assessment function that we see as critical at the national level if policies and national institutions are to be aware of what's happening at smaller levels of governance and are able to put in place policies that help communities and households. There's also a prioritization function, and this is really the heart of policymaking. It's the heart of budgeting. But thinking about budgeting and national development priorities with climate change in mind takes some changes to how those priorities and how those decisions are made. Also coordination, which I mentioned earlier. It's very hard to get adaptation right at a large scale like a national level without coordinating across sectors and coordinating across different agencies. Information management is another critical institutional function. We find many countries in the developing world don't have the census institutions set up, for example, or their meteorological services or their agricultural extension services. These systems for managing information are more and more important now that the climate's changing. And then our final function, this was the hardest one to put a name to. We called it climate risk reduction. And this is really the very deliberate and systematic process of identifying critical risks to a development pathway in a particular place and figuring out how you reduce those risks. And that looks quite different in the agricultural sector than in the urban planning sector. But in other ways, the process is similar. The actual activities will differ, but taking those steps to utilize assessment information and put in place new prioritization processes to really reduce specific risks is captured here. In addition to this publication that I already raised up, I thought I'd also mention a set of case studies that we undertook at WRI. I don't have a glossy version of this one with me, but on our website there's several case studies, and they were looking primarily at information, but they looked at the role of information in facilitating adaptation and the kinds of information that are important for adaptation. And in Nepal, we had actually quite an interesting example from the NAPA process, where the national level decision-making process was structured very intentionally to gather information from localities across the country. They used actually a fairly systematic transect process of policymakers and a multi-stakeholder process that visited a diversity of locations across the country and fed that information into the National Adaptation Program of Action. It wasn't a perfect process, but it's an interesting one to look at as you consider the dynamic between national decision-making and local decision-making. I've spoken quite a lot about facilitation or barriers or the enabling environment from the national to the local, but there's also a critical process of flow of information and priorities and ideas from the local up to the national. And I think in Nepal, there's a number of experiments with that process underway that are worth taking a look at. In terms of needs and next steps or recommendations, very, very loosely speaking, this is my last slide here. The first thing that we've seen, kind of taking stock of our work at WRI and lessons we've learned, as far as institutions go, it's a good moment coming up. There's enough experience and practice at the national level, at least, to look across a number of countries and take stock of what kinds of coordination mechanisms seem to work, and what kinds of information management systems are making a difference and supporting adaptation. And as we talk about institutions, more and more I have people saying, well, yes, I know we need to coordinate, but we don't know how. What's a good system for coordination? So there's a need for this kind of stock taking. Secondly, there's a real need for monitoring systems that are practical. There's a lot of attention in adaptation to monitoring and evaluation in a very bureaucratic, I'll say, sense of the word. The development community wants to make sure their projects are having the impact that they want, and they want to be able to report out to Congress or to funders that they've succeeded with their adaptation projects, and that there's monitoring evidence for that. We actually need something that's a little more forward-thinking. We need to move beyond evaluating projects to being able to evaluate over the long term whether adaptation priorities are being realized and whether the things we thought would work in a changing climate really are working. This has to be much more systematic and much more country-owned than many of the monitoring systems we're familiar with. Thirdly, there's more and more question about private institutions, and they were briefly on one of my slides here. But I think there's not a lot of clarity yet as to what it is that the private sector can do on adaptation, what constitutes a private institution, and how do we fit them into some of the different frameworks that we have out there. There's frameworks for national governance and for communities and even for watersheds, but often they're not very systematic with thinking about private institutions. So this might be a fruitful area for discussion. Finally, I would say that uncertainty, and uncertainty in particular with regard to the climate, we've evolved as a society with a relatively stationary climate in most of the world. But the uncertainty is quite challenging to a lot of our institutions. It may really demand new ways of making decisions, new criteria for evaluating what we choose to do and why we choose to do it, and thinking about much more systematically tackling uncertainty, communicating it in new ways, using scenarios, for example, for planning rather than planning for a particular future. This is another critical area for next steps that we see at WRI. So with that, I will say thank you and pass the microphone along to Todd. Yes?
Thank you, Heather. As previously mentioned, we'll be doing a little unorthodox organization. I will present the first half of my presentation outlining the project at which we've conducted in conjunction with Oxfam. I will pass the microphone to Professor Kassa, who will deliver some information about Ethiopia, and then I will come back doing some synthetic discussion. Much like in Heather's presentation, we also like to draw on Arun Agrawal's work, starting with the premise that adaptation to climate is inevitably local. It happens, adaptation being a process of change in human behavior. In a particular environment, it happens in a place. Starting with this recognition, Agrawal, and these are all direct quotes from Agrawal, points out that the role of social institutions is central to understanding these processes of change, which is adaptation to climate. Local social institutions structure impacts and vulnerability, who is most vulnerable to climate signal in terms of their livelihoods. Local social institutions mediate between individual and collective responses to climate adaptation and climate impacts. And finally, local social institutions act as a means of delivery, a buffer or a sort of a conduit between national processes, between markets, between international development NGOs, et cetera, and local social process. So this is a very key social location for understanding how change occurs. In response to this framing of adaptation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation put out a call for research on this topic, a call which Oxfam America responded to. We have Gina Castillo and Tigis Gizal in the back of the room, who are the architects of this proposal, with the goal of understanding for Oxfam America and other similar organizations, how can development organizations engage in adaptation in a way that is creative in the way they articulate with local social institutions, is respectful of the existing local social dynamics, and is particularly effective in facilitating adaptive change. Basically, what is there that should be known by such organizations about adaptation processes at local levels? The research that we designed, I am the international research coordinator for that. We had 2 national research consultants and their respective teams, Dejene Debsu in Ethiopia and Mamadou Traore and Point Sud, his organization in Mali. We had a couple of MSc students under my supervision from Wageningen University. The research was done in 2 sites where Oxfam has had a long-term investment, in the Borana zone in Ethiopia, which is largely pastoral. But as you will see in the subsequent presentation, it's not entirely pastoral. And southeastern Mali, which is a cotton growing area where Oxfam has been invested for a long time, doing some comparison between the very old cotton growing areas and areas where it's picked it up most recently. Notably, both of these areas are susceptible to drought. They have easily indicated a high vulnerability to drought stress, and so that's a point of interest. And all of this research was done in the spring to summer of 2011. We, as a team, identified 3 key research questions that we wanted to look into. First off, what is the role of local social institutions in long-term adaptation to environmental change? You notice I've done a little wordplay here and moved from climate change to environmental change. This closely interrelated, and we can learn a lot from even non-climate driven environmental change, the role of social institutions. And also long-term, we are not trying to get at short-term coping mechanisms. There's been a lot of research already done on that, but really trying to understand climate adaptation as a sort of a slow burn, long-term transformation in cultural practice, and that's very broadly construed. The second question is, how have extra local actors interacted with local social institutions in development and adaptation efforts? What are the ways in which governments, non-governmental organizations, development organizations, market actors, the channels through which they have approached local social dynamics, both at an institutional level, how do they try and reach individuals? So again, this is that mediating role of local social institutions. And particularly kind of as a little extra icing on the cake, we are particularly interested in how the use of weather and climate information exists in local practice. There's a lot of literature examining the frequent disconnect between scientific meteorology and farmers' use of it. There's some smaller amount of research on local meteorology, on the practices for anticipating upcoming seasons that we were keen on integrating because weather and climate information is often used as a key point for adaptation. How can we use information more effectively? And of course, this starts with how is information being used at present? What kinds of information? Again, how is it mediated? How is it used or not used in these particular contexts? By way of a little bit of conceptual clarification, we're talking about local social institutions as the key reference point in this topic. And we, within the Oxfam project, spent quite a while identifying what do we mean by an institution. We were using this in reference to formal organizations with a board of directors or a particular location. So it's formally organized. This can be village councils, can be trade associations, can be cooperatives. But we also strove to emphasize that informal local social institutions are equally important. They're not so deeply codified, but are still highly influential in the way people access and use resources. Just by way of example, land tenure practices and gender divisions of labor are not a formal organization, but they are central social institutions to defining people's adaptive behavior. So institutions is broadly conceptualized, and likewise, what do we mean by local? These are, when we start to talk about local and national, we start to create some false boundaries because they're heuristically useful. But we're particularly interested in where does the legitimacy come from in this organization or institution, and where's the accountability? So we looked at those as the particular reference points for defining what is a local social institution. They are made legitimate by people living in a place, and they are accountable to the people living in that place. In terms of methodology, we as a team developed a shared framework in terms of the research questions, in terms of the research design and the methods we used. Quite, I think uniquely, everyone in the project was a anthropologist, quite by chance, honestly. So we focused on qualitative methods with a specific eye to looking at the social mechanisms of change. Qualitative research is very strong in identifying the process-oriented perspectives in how does change occur, what are the mechanisms that lead to transformation or sometimes that block transformation. As such, we use a very mixed methods approach, interviews, household surveys for more sort of descriptive, statistical, quantitative information, but also a lot of case study development, focus groups, life histories to get the broad arc of change in the course of many decades. So at this, I'm going to break off for a moment. I will pass the mic to Professor Kassa to go into the details in the Ethiopian case study. I will be back to do some synthesis discussion.
Thank you very much, Todd. The author of this report was Dr. Dejene, who unfortunately couldn't make it. I'm going to present his presentation on his behalf. So my presentation is going to focus on the Ethiopian case study. This one, okay. So the study was undertaken in southern part of Ethiopia, more specifically in two districts. Moyale is one of the districts, and Yabelo is the other one. So in the study area, pastoralists who live have different strategies and management skills. One of the strategies which has been developed over the generations is the herd splitting, where lactating animals and young animals are kept near the family dwellings, whereas the male and non-lactating animals are taken to distant grazing places. That in a way is meant to utilize the available pasture resources in a very effective way. The other one is mobility in search of better pasture and water resources. This has been over the years eroded in terms of making use of available resources, because there is an infringement of the modern institutions and the pastoral way of life, or I would say the pastoral livelihood system, is weakened because of different reasons, like there is conflict over resource use. Traditional grazing areas have been taken over by commercial farms in some parts of the country. The government policy is not favorable for pastoralists, on the premise that the government officials believe that pastoralism is not a livelihood strategy, which can be depended upon, and they are trying to sedentarize pastoralists. So erosion of property rights over pasture and water is one of the structural problems that pastoralists have to live with. To give some background about pastoralism in Ethiopia and how important it is, close to 10 to 12% of the population of the country depends on pastoralism or agropastoralism. Pastoralism and agropastoralism are also practiced in 3 regions out of 9 in the country, more specifically in Somali, Oromia, and Afar regions. And in some other regions of the country, like Benshangul and Amhara region, there are some pastoralists. Available estimate shows that 30 to 40% of the country's livestock population is found in the areas where pastoralists live. So when it comes to climate change, different studies have shown that if the pastoralists and agropastoralists, as well as small-scale farmers, who are the vulnerable to climate change, and when shocks occur in the country, these are pastoralists and small-scale farmers who are bearing the brunt of the shock. So to come to the study area, in 2011, there was a drought, and that drought was followed by different consequences, like, the drought actually struck the eastern part of the country, and in the eastern African region, close to 12 million people were affected by the drought, and in the country alone, close to 4.5 million people are affected by the drought. So in the study area, the severity of the drought was very tough, and there was limited availability of pasture, which eventually led to the days of animals. Water resources were very limited, and the pastoralists were not able to feed themselves and their families. And that was also followed by serious health problems, both affecting both animals and human beings. As you might see here, I don't know if it is visible from where you are, the severity of the drought can be explained by the fact that pastoralists have lost, depending on the study sites, in one of the study sites, they lost 37% of their animals. In the other second study site, they lost 55% of their animals. So this was followed by a reduction in herd size at household level, and also seriously affecting the livelihood of the pastoralists and agropastoralists. When it comes to local institutions, in the pastoral area where the study was undertaken, we have a GADA system, which is a social structure encompassing social, political, and economic institutions, where the society is stratified into different age groups, and we have hierarchies there. The GADA system is meant to address different aspects of the pastoralist life. When it comes to the climate change, they have their own traditional way of managing and taking care of each other. So as you might see from this summarized version of the study, depending on the severity of the shock, there are different strategies adopted by the pastoral communities. In the short run, we have coping mechanisms, which are like selling animals, skipping meals, and also getting involved in different petty trades. In the long run, there are mechanisms of mutual aid, like the better of the community would give animals to the poor so that the poor wouldn't be destitute, and restocking is taking place in a form of social insurance. Pastoralists have also adopted over the years different strategies like herd diversification. And instead of just keeping only cattle, they are diversifying into browsing species like camel and goats, which are more adapted to bushy grassland, and also which are resistant to water availability, limited water availability. There is also a lot of investment in education in some parts of the country where pastoralists live. Thus, a form of long-term investment. Saving and credit groups are being established. So these are emerging trends, but they are not being undertaken in all parts of the country. This takes place in areas where we have external intervention, like projects being implemented by Oxfam and other non-governmental organizations. This graphical illustration is also very interesting to look at, partly because only very few pastoralists are depending on herding alone. There is a diversification on the livelihood strategies. As you can see here, we have farming, which is taking place, which is in addition to herding. Some pastoralists are also involved in farming. We have trading. We have herding, trading, and farming. So it's only very few pastoralists who are depending on herding alone. So this shows that the communities are diversifying their livelihood strategies and undertaking different activities in addition to herding. So it's only less than 50% of the pastoralists. If you look at those pastoralists who depend on herding alone, among the sample respondents, it's less than 1%. So the other pastoralists, or the great majority of the pastoralists, depend on other livelihood strategies over and above herding. The social support systems that I talked about is a mechanism of social insurance where whenever shocks happen, people are not left alone. Well-to-do families or also community members are giving animals to the poor. In the event that they're not in a position to give animals, there are also ways of supporting them by providing them like grains, milk. This table, this graph here shows the number of animals that are being distributed by better off families to the poor. And restocking is taking place depending on the number of animals that well-to-do families are ready to give to the poor. The other aspect of the resource management system is the fact that traditionally pastoral communities use their management strategies of moving their herd from one location to another. But over the years, this has been weakened partly because the government policy is aiming at sedentarizing pastoralists on the belief that their livelihood strategies are not viable. So they're delimiting their areas in terms of into administrative zones where they won't be able to move anymore from one location to another in search of better pasture and water. So this has been tried in some parts of the country, and it was followed by some unrest. And the government officials have been trying to deal with the problem, but so far we don't have a clear position on the part of the government, whether or not pastoralists must be left to deal with their problems or be dictated by the government decrees. Another aspect of the pastoral way of life is the gender division of labor, where women, in addition to their reproductive role, are actively engaged in different production activities. They are collecting water, they are collecting firewood, fetching water. At times, they are also taking care of small remnants like goats, milking cattle or milking cows, and also camel. But whenever we have environmental shocks, women suffer a lot, partly because they have to travel long distance to fetch water, to collect firewood, and also to collect grass to the small remnants and young animals. So drought increases their workload. The pastoral communities have also their way of predicting or forecasting the weather conditions. there are knowledgeable people in the community who use their traditional knowledge to forecast weather. They use like ripening of certain species of plants, looking at the physical conditions of plants and predict whether or not there will be drought. This is interesting in a sense that the majority of the people depend on their prediction, or they tend to believe more their predictions than the predictions of formal institutions. So the established belief or the perception of the community members is that times have changed. Climate change is an eminent factor. The frequency of droughts is becoming shorter and shorter, and resources are being depleted. So if you look at the information or the data collected on annual rainfall distribution, you would hardly see that there is a decline in rainfall conditions. The linear trend that's fit here shows that only on one of the sites there is a slight reduction in rainfall conditions. But when you look at the rainfall distribution, it's erratic. And understandably, the pastoral communities believe that climate change is there, affecting their lives, and the frequency of drought is becoming shorter and shorter, and their livelihood strategies are being compromised by different factors. When you try to superimpose this on the formal institutions, what the early warning system of the government is doing, since almost the mid-1970s, there is an early warning system put in place, but that system is not a very fine system, partly because the estimates are very crude, and the data being generated are not location specific. At times, it's hardly possible to find location specific data for pastoralist areas. So for that reason, whenever shocks happen, it becomes very difficult to come up with realistic figures. Like in 2011, an attempt has been made to estimate the number of people who are affected by the drought. Initially, the figures hover around 2.8. Then that was increased to 3.2 and ended up by being 4.5. So this shows you that the data generated from the formal institution is not trustworthy. So for that particular reason, maybe pastoralists tend to believe the forecast from their traditional people or from people who live in their areas, who use their traditional knowledge to tell about the weather conditions. So the study pointed out that in one of the study sites, 89% of the respondents, in another study site, 62% of the respondents reported that they tend to believe more the information generated by traditional forecasters. This has its own reasons because one, the data or the information generated by these people is location specific. It pertains to the area where they are. Two, they can make it, or they get it, or they hear it in their own language, and it's also easily accessible. So that's going to be my last slide. The recommendations which came out from the study clearly show that if we want to address issues related to pastoralism and agropastoralism, and if we want to make the pastoral system a viable way of life or strategy, it's important to address issues, the root causes of the problems that facing pastoralists and agro-pastoralists, like making the policy more favorable to them, making different services available like veterinary service, education, making infrastructure available, also creating market access to pastoralists. These are important. The customary insurance system or the mutual aid system that we talked about is something that we can build upon. In fact, the external institutions or non-governmental organizations have been using this restocking strategy that they give animals to pastoralists, and pastoralists would in turn give animals to other poor pastoralists, and it's a kind of revolving credit system. So we have to really build on that system, because if the system works for the pastoralists during stress, we have to learn from the system and build upon it. A while ago, I talked about women, that whenever drought strikes, they're facing lots of problems, workload. So any intervention in the area must try to address problems facing women in the area. Integrate traditional and modern weather forecasting system. As you've seen, pastoralists believe more the traditional forecasters, partly because they generate location-specific information. The information is made available to people in their own language. It's made available timely. So we have to really combine the traditional and the modern weather forecasting system and try to address issues related to trust, especially trusting the formal organizations. The other point is the livelihood strategies are not anymore depending on herding alone. They are being diversified by pastoralists. So diversification should be an important strategy, because if the pastoral way of life is to sustain in the long run, diversification of the livelihood strategy should be considered as an important strategy. In this respect, Oxfam is working with other partners to come up with a policy recommendation depending on the findings of the study. A workshop is going to be organized on the 20th of May in Addis Ababa, bringing together different stakeholders, policymakers, parliamentarians, people from the academia, the private sector. And these people are going to discuss on how to go about influencing policy and trying to make the government more responsive to the problems facing pastoralists. The last recommendation is this research is undertaken in one and specific area. Like I said earlier, pastoralists live in different parts of the country. So probably different research needs to be undertaken in different parts of the country. And in addition to that, the available options and livelihood strategies should be considered. So for that, I think we need to do research in other parts of the country, and also involving probably more people from other disciplines, and trying to look at the problem from different angles. So that's about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Todd, you are back up, correct?
Okay, synthesizing across the report from Ethiopia and from Mali, as well as the two MSc students' theses, when looking at the local social institutions and adaptive dynamics, we found important findings in these 5 categories, which I will be running through sequentially here. Drawing both on some of the work from Ethiopia, which I'll maybe not go quite as deep into and try and spend some more time on Mali. In terms of the technical production strategies of making a living, we found in both Ethiopia and Mali that there is important mediation function in local social institutions. Now, for example, when switching from cattle herding to camels and goats, it sounds pretty simple. Yet, if we think about the implications of this livelihood change, this has a lot to do with different kinds of knowledge of how to care for these different animals, both veterinary knowledge and ecological knowledge about types of fodder, about locations, about timing, about access to markets. But there's also an important sort of cultural taboo function of that camels were historically not to be used in Borana. It's a taboo to herd camels, to eat camels, to interact with them. So that this is not just a technical change, but this is a fairly substantial and fundamental cultural change to go into camel herding. So this is another aspect of mediation where this local social institutions have at one level been resistant to change, but it also have been flexible to make the change in a gradual way. But there, again, there is this sort of a tension and dynamic there. In Mali, we see that farmers have maintained a dual seed system, both the informal seed system of seed exchange of folk varieties and accessing improved varieties through I'm blanking on the name of the cotton company, the Malian Cotton Cooperative. So CDMT, thank you very much. Where you get access to improved seeds, high yielding or highly responsive, but you also get access to credit. They can get access to fertilizer, etc. So this is an important social institution for them to get access to these materials, but they're also very actively maintaining informal networks of seed exchange for flexibility, for diversity in production systems. And this was repeatedly cited as an important aspect of their transforming production practices. In terms of land and water governance, again, Balai had referenced the GADA system, which is this very integrative social structural institution that mediates access to water points, to pastures, and has for a very deep history. There are state, or what's sometimes called modern local institutions, which are emerged from the formal state authority, but still have some credibility and authority locally. So there's in fact a tension between customary and state institutions here, especially in reference to managing these very important land and water resources. Interestingly, in Mali, we also saw some tension between customary and formal state institutions in relation to these issues. Land tenure is customarily managed by village chiefs who have great legitimacy and influence locally. They have no status whatsoever in Malian legal code, but they do influence who has access to land. The older families in villages tend to have better access to better land. Newer families have less access to that, so there is a politics around the access to these resources, which are so important for livelihoods. But then on the other hand, the decentralization of national authority, which is not just happening in Mali, but really across much of Africa, is putting more emphasis upon the mayorships at a commune level, which is, say, 10 to 15 villages. This derives power from the state, though, and they also have an important official role in managing land and water. So again, there's some degree of tension between these, but at the same time, there's a great deal of overlap because powerful village chiefs also have a way of finding their way into mayorships as well. But again, there's a politics around within local social institutions about access to resources. Excuse me. In terms of social support systems, these local social institutions are again very important. The customary institution of Busa Ganofa, which is this sort of a restocking effort when some people fail and others are wealthy. A wealthy cattle owner can choose to gift cattle to others, and this is usually within families. So there's a kinship as a local social institution. It's historically been in place, and in Mali we also see similar aspects of reciprocity within kinship networks and sometimes outside of it. In both of these cases, we've seen a correlation between increased market integration and decreasing social support, customary social support networks. There are a number of potential drivers of that, but I think market integration is an important one because we look, instead of getting credit from your uncle or your father or your distant cousin, you get credit from the CDMT, which has different implications in terms of accountability, in terms of power, in terms of the legitimacy of the relationship between these two actors. Again, this could be said to be true of just development, agricultural development in general, but we see in climate adaptation, the stressors start to become more extreme, more acute, and these relationships and the form that these relationships and social institutions take will make a big difference in terms of people's ability to respond creatively and effectively. As, again, Balai pointed out that there's a gender difference in vulnerability to drought, and we see women and especially young girls are the first to suffer access to education when drought occurs because their workload increases. If water is now 5 kilometers away instead of 2, that's a lot of time and energy invested in simply acquiring water, both for household and cattle watering. In Mali, there's also an interesting dynamic around land access because I mentioned the village organization of access to land, but that is given to households, to heads of households who are almost invariably male, who then distribute land within the household to various household members. So women gain access to land through their fathers, through their husbands. As land pressure becomes more acute and it becomes more valuable, there is material incentive for men to maintain control of the land in their own in their own hands. So women in these research sites have been increasingly struggling to get access to what is customarily their cultural birthright, that they get a garden plot. But again, this is a cultural social institution in change, and it's a social space that is still, it's being contested, that there is a great deal of sort of micro-politics in the village level and also within households about how to gain access to these resources. And again, this has strong implications in long-term climate change, especially in as much as women's access to money and land and productive assets has a great deal to do with children's health. Finally, we found in both sites that the issue of weather and climate information, that in Mali as well, there is relatively low access to and trust in official weather resources. Scientific meteorology is there. Whether or not people draw on it, believe in it, will find much use for it. They generally didn't. However, in both sites, there are active local practices of forecasting, both in the short term in terms of the next few days, which can be very important in timing. Your season can make and break on whether or not you plant before a good rain. But also in terms of long-term, like a seasonal forecast, is this season going to be relatively wet, relatively dry? Both through mundane observation of plants, insects, birds' behavior, but also through arcane specializations. There has been a very, very small amount of work, but increasing interest in co-production of knowledge between these local specialists and scientific meteorologists. Some interesting work in Kenya published recently that seeks to bridge this, as Belay suggested in his recommendations. Now, looking at recommendations, the report has 7 key recommendations. I'm not going to go through all of them in great depth, but I would start by emphasizing there's a strong distinction between looking at adaptive capacities and adaptive processes and looking at adaptive technologies. The investment in, I would suggest as a recommendation, there should be increased investment in and attention to investing in adaptive capacities and ongoing adaptation in communities that can and does operate independent of any sort of external intervention. And this isn't in pure replacement of working on adaptive technologies through research and science institutes, but to give this relatively more attention than it's getting in the present. So it looks at adaptation through a processual lens rather than a sort of the techno-fix silver bullet perspective. And very closely relating to Heather's adaptation manifesto, I recommend that the adaptation, especially in agrarian contexts and pastoral context, should start with local practices, local institutions, and local dynamics. Adaptation isn't something waiting for policy and for science to come and do it. Adaptation is happening. It's out there, it's embedded within people's day-to-day lives, within local social institutions and those dynamics. So that's organizations such as development organizations can start with the assumption that that's going on and look for what are those dynamics, what are those capacities, and not just capacity, but actions going on. How can those be complemented and built upon rather than designing adaptation from outside and bringing it, presuming to bring it to people. We found in both cases that there are active and sometimes tensions between customary and state institutions at the local level. As a recommendation, we recommend engaging both of them to have some semblance of balance, some semblance of legitimacy in both spheres. And I didn't go into this very much in my presentation, but in both Mali and Ethiopia, there were some interesting findings about market integration. And sometimes it works quite effectively at augmenting livelihoods, and sometimes it is, in fact, can backfire. So that we recommend that integrating with markets in a selective fashion, so you can identify when it will be really beneficial for communities. We recommend, from a policy point of view, that acknowledging access to educational opportunity, political and financial opportunities is an important part of adaptive capacity or adaptation processes, especially for women. I've been in some circles with climate modelers who say, you know, that's development, that's not adaptation. But I think if we look at the adaptive dynamics on the ground, we see that these are very important qualities and skills to have that enable good adaptation and endogenous adaptation. Diversification of livelihoods into non-climate sensitive activities, and I would include within diversification of livelihood urban and foreign migration and this remittances from foreign family members is a part of an adaptive strategy from a family point of view. So again, that's an institutional lens. And finally, we recommend doing more work trying to synergize the local and climate, local and scientific production of climate information. So to get the strength and power of scientific meteorology, as well as the strength and power and the social legitimacy of local observational-based practices. By way of kicking off the conversation for discussion points, I think these first two are the most encompassing and starting points for the discussion in the relative merits of adaptive capacities and engaged in adaptive processes versus investment and research in adaptation technologies, as well as the relative merits and the challenges of starting with local practices and entering into those dynamics as they're on running. And at that, I open the floor to questions, I guess.
Thanks very much. So thank you to all of the speakers. I want to say I really think this report is excellent. For those of you who have not read it, it is genuinely worth the read. I really think it contributes to the field of climate change adaptation, and specifically the detailed nature of the research, along also with the sort of framework that Heather presented, really gets into the specifics of the functions, the mechanisms, the characteristics of institutions that are facilitating adaptation. And I think by looking at those specifics, we can really begin to helpfully challenge ourselves to think about a more non-traditional set of climate change interventions, which are through, I think you described it in the report as non-climate specific interventions. There are lots of ways that we can promote adaptive capacity in the world, and institutions are a key aspect of that. And I think the way the research was done and the way that the findings are presented, it really helps us challenge ourselves and really to think a little more creatively about what climate change, adaptive capacity to climate change looks like in the real world. In my role as moderator, I want to take the liberty of putting a first question on the table before I open the floor. And that is, within the report as well, you mention a variety of attributes which sort of hint at the context of conflict or fragility in which the studies were conducted. There is specific mention of the perceptions of institutions as being accountable and legitimate, which very closely mirrors in the conflict world our notion of fragility as being the two dimensions of effectiveness and legitimacy, and the nature of the state-society relationship. The majority of the places where we are providing foreign assistance in the world, including climate change, adaptation, and mitigation support, are affected by conflict and fragility in some way. The two places where you have done the studies are affected by both conflict and fragility at the local level as well as the national level. And yet the report does not address that particular issue head on. So I was wondering if any of you wanted to say something about how local institutions and their adaptive capacities are, what's the right way to say this, are affected by the context of conflict or fragility, how those adaptive capacities are affected specifically by conflict, or how we might seize an opportunity in building local adaptive capacity to better address some of those dynamics as well, beyond just the stress of climate change, but the stress of fragility or conflict in those situations. If through the research lens, you might provide any observations about that aspect of things, I would appreciate that. But before I ask you to answer that directly, why don't we see if there are some comments, questions from the floor. We can take a few at a time to give all of the speakers a few minutes to think about their responses. So who would like to offer up something first? Second, since I took the first spot. Please. And if I could ask you, you'll get a microphone. If everyone could introduce themselves, that would be very helpful.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Ling and I'm from American University. I have a question. I guess my question is, in your case studies, is there any presence or assistance of so-called elite capture in local institutions? And how does that have impact on the performance and the role of local institution in adapting to climate change? Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Stephanie Burgos with Oxfam. I was curious if you could go into a bit more about the issue of climate data and the integration, and in terms of the recommendations based on what you found, this looking at how to integrate traditional knowledge with scientific data, and I guess that gets to also the question of knowledge of and understanding on the part of the communities of the need for that. So is there a perceived need, and how would you go about effectively integrating those two systems at the local level?
Thank you. Why don't I give the speakers a chance to respond to those three questions. The first was on conflict and fragility, second on elite capture, and third on the integration of climate data. Which one of you wants to jump in first?
Paper, scissors. Yeah, the conflict and fragility question, I think, did in its way arise in both of these contexts in the course of the research. I think just given the maybe disciplinary lenses that we had, we weren't using that language. But certainly in terms of in Ethiopia, the tension between the state, which has a very strong bias against pastoralism historically, and pastoralists experience an adaptation and increasingly losing access to good pasture, to water rights. This did come up. We didn't ever focus so much on the role of the state. The state was, as we put it, an extra local actor. So we really tried to put a local dynamics focus on this, and then other extra locals were kind of things that entered into that sphere. It was such an encompassing question. Where does one start? And I think likewise in Mali, for example, this was done before the whole political crisis in Mali, just before. I think in the southern part of Mali, the conflict and state fragility wasn't as big of an issue. I think when the further north you go in Mali, I did my own PhD research in Mali, so this is home ground for me. Into the more pastoral zones in Mali, in central and northern Mali, then farmer-herder conflicts around access to pasture and the conversion of pasture to agriculture, and the crowding of water resources with agriculture, which again mirror, I think, a lot of the same issues in Ethiopia. That becomes a greater and greater issue, and that's where the question of who has authority over space makes a difference. And there's a tension again between village chiefs, between mayors, and between regional administrators of the Malian government for who's supposed to be managing these spaces and defining what is a pasture, what is a field, what is a cattle trail, and what is a water resource that's supposed to be kept open. So there's sort of a legal pluralism that's in effect there that is sometimes undermining it's creating a space for increased conflict in a way, because it's not clear who is accountable, who has the authority to determine. I don't know if that answers your question well.
It's a big provocative question.
Yeah.
That was great.
Others on that one?
I mean, I can just say very briefly that anytime you're examining institutions as a focal point for adaptation or a starting point, it's this is not a cookie cutter process. We've created these frameworks. We've tried to talk about generic functions of institutions and qualities or traits of institutions. But with all of these frameworks, we preface our recommendations that there's also a need for just a very fundamental contextual analysis before you start using a generic framework, and understanding what are you contending with. Are you in a place where formal institutions aren't really functioning, and you need to look primarily at informal institutions? Is there a political economy analysis that can help you understand the dynamics of elite capture, and which of these institutions that may play certain roles are only playing those roles for a certain set of players? And it's quite a complicated picture, and I think this kind of start where you are idea that something is bound to be happening in a fragility or a conflict context means that very often it's happening in a very unplanned, autonomous way, where the adaptation is not only to climate change but to the conflict and to the other stressors, and they're very interrelated, and that formal institutions may not be necessarily the best starting point. So it's kind of good to have this as an overarching caveat. There's always a danger for those of us whose attention tends to be drawn toward formal institutions who want to be building capacity for national level institutions, that you can miss the big picture sometimes with these frameworks. Oh, and on the information question, the Kenya example that Todd raised is quite an interesting one of really a very systematic effort on behalf of the National Meteorological Service and some of the universities to actively connect with some of the traditional forecasting methods. And there's been several things written about it recently, so it's worth a look to those of you interested in that question.
Any other comments on elite capture or the integration of climate data?
Do you want to address any?
No, I think the question raised by Stefani, I see your concern. But the point is, you see, local communities need timely, accurate, and usable information. In areas where you don't have meteorological stations, that's the case where pastoralists live. Community members tend to depend on traditional forecasters. The point would be, in the report, it is clearly indicated that there were instances where some traditional forecasters were not providing reliable information. And for that, they were outcast. The report clearly states that. So you have to really build on that, capitalize on that. And if there are information that we can make use of from traditional forecasters, we have to learn from that and build on that. And as far as possible, the state institutions or formal institutions must have at least satellite stations to generate data and provide them as information to the pastoralists. As it stands now, that's not the case. So the whole issue would be, are there elements that we can take from traditional forecasters and integrate them into the formal institution? Otherwise, in the absence of predictions from formal institutions, pastoralists would depend on traditional forecasters.
Other comments or questions?
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Kyle Rierick, USAID. I was very interested in some of the factors that you've pointed out. One thing that struck me, though, was no discussion of the changes in the fire regime. So when I think about the de-emphasization of in Yabella and those areas, obviously the delegitimization of both traditional institutions, the Gutta system in particular, and also the pastoralism as a way of life are key. But so has the wholesale transformation of the resource because of the loss of the fire regime starting in the 70s prior to the prior administration. So we see acacia species taking up 80 to 90% of the arable land in these areas, and also mesquite as well, an invasive species. And so the state delegitimizing these traditional practices, transforming the way that the land can be managed, has put these people in a much more fragile situation that has made climate change as a trigger a much more of an issue because adaptive capacity is very low because of these situations. And I unfortunately have not read your report. I just would like you to talk a little bit about those transformations, and maybe also as I mean, the Gutta system certainly could be, and that's something we've been interested in, how it can be supported, but it's also beyond the scale of the Gutta to actually address these conflictual elements. So how do you see the role between the state and traditional elements? Can you talk a little bit more about how those can be supported? Because in the age of climate change and dealing with these larger natural resource issues, scale is such an important thing. So multiple things hiding in there, but anyway, thanks.
I can say that, especially regarding the landscape transformation through changing policy and some development intervention practices in Ethiopia, this is, I think fire is covered in there, some is covered quite well in Dejene's country report. In the synthesis report, I don't think I go so far with it, but if you go to the background report just on Ethiopia, that's covered fairly nicely. So this transformation of species, and indeed some of them are a direct result of development intervention by I don't remember whom, and suddenly there's noxious species coming up all over the place. But that does emphasize that looking for just a climate signal in this is missing the point. That the policy environment and these landscape transformations that emerge from discriminatory policies, in effect, as well as land enclosure and water enclosure, those are as big a pressure on adaptive capacity as or the environmental stress that herders experience as much as the climate is. And that's a danger, I think, in a lot of climate adaptation research that tends to look at it as a technical thing, and the politics that go behind those things kind of gets washed out. And methodologically speaking, I think that's one of the strengths of the approach we've taken, of really trying to get through ethnographic detail to really understand the mechanisms that connect climate signal, policy, environmental change, gender roles in households, that these things are related if we take the time and depth to see them. So that might be an extra recommendation of climate adaptation is never just about climate. I think I may have addressed part of your question. About the Gada.
Scale. About thinking about scale, and that traditional systems then aren't actually, the Gada system doesn't actually deal with the scale that allows full mobility once you already have these other changes in landscape that are putting so much more pressure on individuals. And what do you see as possibilities of traditional and state relationship that could be a bridge?
Well, I'm more of a West African specialist, and Mali is more my thing, so I don't want to speak too authoritatively on Ethiopia, but again, in my reading of these reports, it was that there has historically been a competition, that the gut has been systematically dismantled, deliberately dismantled. So historically, I understand it has operated at quite some large scale. Whether or not trying to re-achieve that capacity is the right pathway for moving forward is another question.
I think on that point, the report also underlines that the GADA system was weakened intentionally by the government, partly because it was seen as a challenge to the formal institution. It was like running a parallel institutional framework, and the government was not happy about it. And that has been done since almost 40 years now, since the military regime. The other point that you have mentioned about the encroachment of bushy species. Prior to the 1970s, pastoralists were free to practice bushfire system. That was prohibited by law, and they cannot practice bush firing system. And that helped the emergence of bushy species, and that has been encroaching in almost all parts of the pastoral areas. The other problem which is also affecting the pastoral system is the delimitation of the administrative zones. In the past, this actually restricted their mobility. In the past, they used to go from one area where there is less pasture to other area where pasture is abundant. Because of the fact that the the delimitation of the administration system was put in place, that has created a kind of animosity among the different ethnic groups, like between the Somalis and the Oromos. So they cannot trespass that territory, and they go to track their animals to that area.
Other questions, comments?
Hi, thanks for the presentations. Brandon Wu from ActionAid USA. I wanted to ask something that sort of riffs off of something Heather said in your presentation, which was that there's sort of open questions about the role of the private sector and what constitutes a private sector institution, what are their roles in adaptation. And a number of us in the room are involved in the policy work around international climate finance, and of course that's a big issue in that arena, is how to leverage private sector finance for climate activities. And it seems like most folks are stumped about how the private sector might be involved in adaptation. And it seems from the conclusions to this report, it seems to me at least, that it's very difficult to envision a role for the private sector in a lot of these activities, at least in the way the private sector is envisioned in this debate, which is leveraging funding from large international private sector entities. So I was just wondering if the panelists agree with that assessment, or if you disagree, what your comments might be. Thanks.
There were at least 2 more questions we can take before the panelists respond.
Jack Warner with Climate Institute. As far as the local institutions being able to, be aware of a lot of these issues and knowing that there are some adaptive technologies that they can use to address climate change, what do you consider to be maybe the top 2 or 3 obstacles for them to have that knowledge of these technologies? And then B, what are the obstacles for them to actually be able to implement it? Is it primarily a financial obstacle? And are there ways for them to find, resources to implement these new adaptive technologies?
Can you give a couple of examples of what adaptive technologies you're having in mind?
Would be primarily both renewable energy being able to be used, either solar, wind, biomass technologies, and secondly, in terms of new agriculture practices and different types of forms of sustainable agriculture farming.
There was another question on the left side, I think.
Thank you. My name is Modani Moreira. I'm with Oxfam America. My question is really simple, and it relates to the last point you made about climate change, about climate information and the usefulness of this for farmers and their access to it. And I'm curious in terms of whether you have examples of where that information has been made accessible to your ordinary farmer, because we had a similar experience in Cambodia where the meteorological department was unable to package the information in a way that was accessible to farmers in a timely way, in a language that they understood, in a format that they understood. So I'm just curious, because it really is critical. Access to the information is critical for you to be able to actually use it.
Thank you. All right, why don't we take these questions first? Climate finance in the private sector, obstacles to adaptive technologies, and barriers to climate information.
Well, I could start with the private sector question. I actually agree, Brandon. I think the finance community is asking the wrong question, and they're making some assumptions that we need to unpack quite a bit. There's this hope that a little bit of private money put into a pool somewhere at the global level can become a magnet, or public money can become a magnet for private money, and I think it's very simplistic. But if we expand our understanding of what constitutes the private sector, and we start to look at small and medium-sized enterprises, and we look at the private actions of households or of collectives, then you start to see a lot more action and a lot of activity that really matters for vulnerable people. The big private sector, they may be important players in some large cities or in the developed world, but in places where markets are not always serving vulnerable people very well, we we can't have too high a hope for this. But we can start to look at how small and mid-sized enterprises put their own money, what kind of adaptations they're undertaking, and are there ways to make that easier and cheaper through policy? Are there ways to make that easier and cheaper through value chains? And through the value chain, okay, now you're starting to maybe get connected with some of those large private players in cases where vulnerable people do have access to markets, which has its pros and cons. And actually, maybe Professor Casa and Todd would be interested in sharing a little more detail on that piece of their recommendation.
Touching on the private sector question, I think one area that's starting to get some attention is index insurance for smallholder farmers in developing countries. I don't know a great deal about it, but I know it's out there and that it's being explored. That might not be exactly the private sector sort of thing you had in mind, but as a sort of financial instrument for trying to cover risk, that it is I see essentially a private sector enterprise. In terms of the question about obstacles to adaptive technologies, I think it has to be very case specific as what is the nature of the technology, why. I mean, certainly there are a lot of really interesting technologies that are extremely expensive and would be great if there was a ton of money, but that basically means it's not great if it's not accessible through financial. So things that are accessible financially, that are effective technically as a agricultural instrument, are more appropriate than sort of higher tech solutions. And this is where I think in our recommendations and when I see Heather start where you are principle, it's what are the existing innovations that are going on? Who are the people in whatever area you're working in who are doing things that are a little bit different, that are a little bit more effective, who are succeeding where others are struggling? To look at those as so rather than looking at the obstacles, what are the people who are succeeding? And they're doing this in context, they're doing this in the social networks where agriculture is taking place. They're doing it on resources social resources and often financial resources that others have some proximity of access to. So I'm increasingly less interested in looking for obstacles to implementation of some idealized technology, but looking for who is doing well under real current conditions and under real social conditions. The last question was on climate information. The greatest success stories that I know about, especially around seasonal climate forecasting, are from Australia, where they really have gotten a good connection between meteorological services, between information use and farmers' practice, and they're really transforming things at a very large scale. And agriculture in Australia is at a very large scale. But I would say I incidentally did a postdoc on seasonal climate forecasting in southern Georgia, and even there, we'll wait and see, and we'll watch this for a few 5 or 10 years and start to see what this information is. How does it move? How might I apply it? How can I play with it? Where would I have won if I used it? Where would I have lost if I used it? So this is not a developing country thing. This is all over the place in terms of matching the nature of information, the timeliness of it, the specificity of it to the real decision-making processes that farmers anywhere use is a tremendous challenge.
David? Oh, wait for the microphone, please. Don't have a quiet voice, but let's make sure it's captured.
David Wasco with Oxfam. I have a question about the interplay between national level institutions and local level institutions, picking up in part on the schematic that Heather put up in a slide. about the various scales and the interrelations between them. We heard a little bit, I think, about the ways in which national institutions shouldn't relate to local institutions in the case of the GATA system. But I'm wondering, what are the positive roles that national level institutions can play in terms of building the adaptive capacity of local institutions?
Any other questions on the floor before we answer that?
I'm Gina Castillo, and I work for Oxfam America. And just to follow on David's question, I'm interested in, and this specifically to Heather, of examples where you see that the national is actually supporting the local institutions. Because increasingly, what I see is that a lot of local institutions under recurring crisis, and you see this in Borana, they're collapsing because, you know, it's before it was 8-year cycles that the droughts were coming. Now they're coming every 4 years, every 2 years. So all these things are overstretched. And so it's not a case of whether they're not legitimate anymore, but it's like, how can they be strengthened? It's not one or. And I'm just thinking of if there are good examples that in your work that you're seeing where the national is actually strengthening the local.
Well, maybe one more question up front before we answer that.
We can get our round of Oxfam America questions in. I'm Kathleen Mogelgard, also with Oxfam America, and I was really intrigued, Heather, by the point that you made about the need for more practical monitoring systems, and I wondered if you could elaborate on that a little bit. I think you talked about how we need to move beyond project evaluation and look more toward long-term outcomes, and fitting back in with today's theme of institutions and institutional arrangements, are there existing institutional arrangements that can help us move in that more practical direction? Or to get there, do you think it's going to require some kind of new institutional enabling environment? Thank you.
Well, I mean, if I can take a start at these, and they're all connected, I guess. I actually think one of the most important areas for the national institutions to support the local institutions is with information. One of the earlier questions around how do you get information to local communities in a way that helps them, and blending the local traditional information with the more formal scientific information. I actually think this is something national institutions really need to help with. And there's examples coming up. For example, more so than the seasonal forecasts, I think in the developing country context, what really is a good value for money, bang for your buck, is early warning systems, and getting farmers or pastoralists or local communities advanced knowledge, even if it's just a day when an extreme event is coming or when there's a surprising weather phenomenon. This is an area where there's a lot of room for improvement, and where there's usually efficiency and effectiveness to be had through national level action. I think one of the examples we've had of national institutions supporting local institutions, and it's a work in progress, we don't know exactly how this is going to pan out, but it's in Nepal, where not only was their national adaptation program of action developed through a process of gathering information that legitimized local institutions, but moving forward, they've crafted a local adaptation program of action that's been developed and mandated at the national level in policy, and is designed to be implemented and supported by new local institutions that have been created through a process of constitutional change that's still underway there. But in conjunction with that, there's a piece of legislation that's been passed mandating that 80% of adaptation finance be delivered to local institutions and spent at the local level, and that's meaningful if it happens. If the national government and the donors and the NGOs manage to get that kind of money to the local level and spent at the local level, I think we'll see a very different kind of use of climate finance than if it's spent and programmed exclusively at the national level. The monitoring systems question is a trickier one, and there's some work we're involved in right now, partnering with IIED actually to explore what can be learned from existing monitoring system outside of the climate sphere and brought into the monitoring world of adaptation. Stay tuned. We should have some findings from this study in June or July. IIED also are working on some national level monitoring systems that I think, if they're successful, will be owned and embedded in national systems in a way that project level monitoring tends not to be. And I'm hopeful and optimistic about this. The key to it is to structure monitoring around existing data systems, around national census systems, around surveys that get conducted in the regular course of business in a particular place. I recently had an example where there's a Caribbean regional tourism agency that surveys tourists in the Caribbean, and some researchers I'm working with managed to just get a couple of climate change questions added into the standard tourist survey that helped really just seamlessly integrate climate change into a survey that gets done on a regular basis. It's an example of private sector action actually that isn't leveraging money, or if you really wanted to bean count, maybe we could figure out what that's worth. But for me, that's actually pretty powerful, a private sector survey that's taken on a regular basis, and we can kind of build climate change into it. So this is where I'm most hopeful, is where countries have existing systems or they have systems that are under development. Every country needs a census. Most countries have some kind of state of environment reporting. These kinds of processes, if we can create monitoring systems that use them and that support them, I think we're much more likely to get monitoring systems that are really effective over the long term and at a large scale, rather than just project by project.
Todd or Bilal? Additional comment?
I would just add to that, I think this is a very important question, especially as adaptation finance starts to come online, is that there are very important implications for how that is chosen to be spent. And this is a really interesting development in Nepal, and I think it will, if there are long-term country-by-country comparisons, you'll see big differences of local programming versus national programming. But likewise, I think there's a certain implicit politics to the choices about monitoring and evaluation. If it is a project sort of logic of that implies certain indicators and certain processes and certain expectations and timelines, but if we start from a perspective that change or adaptation is always going on, it's always been going on, and it's an iterative, ongoing process that people do, that it's complex, it's not a linear response to a single thing, but it's unpredictable, and it's integrating a lot of different factors, then that has very different implications for how do we, at a policy level, choose to implement tracking of change. If it's not linear, then we can't set the benchmarks in advance about what to expect, because you don't know what to expect, because this is the nature of complexity. if we accept that you don't know when changes will happen or transformative changes will happen, then setting 5-year benchmarks can really be counterproductive and really lead to perverse logics in how money is invested. So that at that level, there's a strong implication for the effects that the money will have. This is no longer adapting to the climate. This is adapting to a pot of money, which I think is a very, very important thing to keep an eye on, is that this throwing money at a question doesn't necessarily help solve it. It can, in fact, make it more difficult, because we're adapting to climate change and we're adapting to a climate change adaptation fund too.
One last comment before we wrap it up.
Wadud Khan, NASA Earth Science Office. We're talking about institutions here. Institutions have a more problem changing rather than to these changes, because it's the local institutions would be forced to change because their circumstances are changing, right? But looking towards them, we have our own institutions that are less likely to change. And we generally create those institutions in local countries as mirror images of what we have.
Mm.
So the bigger challenge is to start making those changes in institutions in developed countries for this to be really effective. And it's actually not the change, it's the volatility that would be very hard to predict and to adjust to. I think that probably would be the single most important.
Yeah, that's very much what I was referring to in these, say, the culture and the institutionalization of particular forms of monitoring and evaluation. That's an institutional change that makes a difference in how all these other activities play out. So some degree of critical reflexivity on the part of policy and science are going to be an important part of climate adaptation in rural Mali.
Well, I regret that we've come to the end of our session, but I am happy to report that for those of you who have a few minutes, there is a reception outside, and you are all encouraged to stay for refreshments and to continue speaking with one another and the panelists about these issues. And I would like to thank everyone for engaging in a great conversation this afternoon, and I hope you'll join me in thanking the panelists for presenting their research and their manifestos for us to all consider and take forward in our work. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. I'm sure you love it.